C'est un grand honneur
It's a great honor
et un plaisir,
and a pleasure,
tout particulier,
a very special pleasure, to welcome
à Monsieur
Mr. Emmanuel Macron,
Président.
President of the French Republic.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
votre présence
your
ici,
presence here
avec une salle pleine
with a very full hall
a une
has a very
importance
special
tout à
importance
fait particulière. Et cela pour deux raisons.
for two reasons.
Premièrement,
First,
le thème
the theme of our annual meeting this year is to build a common future
dans un monde
in a fractured world.
Si le monde est
If the world is
fracturé,
fractured today,
c'est certainement
it is
dû
certainly
aux
because of
conséquences
the
des
consequences
politiques
of political,
économiques,
economic, climate, and also especially technological and social change which confront us today.
Vous avez
You have
démontré
shown today
qu'aujourd'hui,
that
ce n'est plus
it is no longer so much the battle between the right and the left which upset our ideological thoughts, but rather the confrontation
entre ceux qui
between
combattent
those who embrace change
et ceux qui préparent
and those who proactively change things for this new world
en utilisant
by using and taking advantage of all the opportunities offered by Revolution 4.0.
et d'autre côté,
And, on the other hand, those who are resistant to change and who look for salvation in the past and in illusionism.
vous êtes
You have been warmly welcomed here
parce que vous êtes
because
le
you
symbole
are
de
the
cette
symbol of this policy which we so badly
que
need
nous attendions
and which we are waiting for to guide us
dans ce
in this new world.
La deuxième raison
The second reason
de l'importance
for the
de votre
importance of
présence
your presence here
également dans le fait que l'année
lies in the fact that 2018 will certainly be a decisive year for the future of the European Union.
nous avons la
We
confiance
have a great opportunity, and I speak
je
here
m'exprime ici avec
as
une passion
a
tout à fait
passionate
particulière.
and convinced European,
Un de ceux qui ont
and I'm
vécu
also one of those who really lived through the Second World War.
Mais nous avons grâce
But thanks to the European Union,
aujourd'hui une
we have
stabilité économique
economic and political stability, which is the
qui était un
guarantor
rêve au début pour ma
of
génération.
peace in our region, and that is so important for people of my generation.
Vous avez su depuis votre élection
Since your election, Mr. President, just 8 months ago, you have been able to restore confidence in France. You have given back hope, not only to
non seulement
young people,
mais
but also to all generations, including mine.
merci d'être venu.
Thank you for having come to
Un
us.
habitué de
I think that you are a person who comes regularly to Davos.
jusqu'à nous aujourd'hui.
Thank you for coming to Davos again today. We are grateful to you, and we hope to share your prospects and perspectives with us now. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, professeur.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dear
Moi
Klaus.
aussi saluer les vice-présidents.
I would also like to salute the vice presidents of this forum.
Le choix, je pense,
I think that this is an important choice that you have made this year, and I would like to welcome our vice presidents, as well as the heads of state and government who are present here, as well as all the friends that are here in the hall.
the paradoxes of globalization. And the most obvious paradox when you arrive here at this moment is to be talking about globalization in a place almost cut off from the rest of the world by snow. And for sure, with Davos, when you look outside, especially coming and arriving in this building, it could be hard to believe in global warming. Obviously, and fortunately, you didn't invite anybody skeptical with global warming this year. So, you decided to address a series of challenges today regarding our current environment. And my first response is probably to navigate these challenges in France and in Europe. We've already executed a set of action that I will review for you, and we will continue with the same drive. But let us not be naive. Today, globalization in general is going through a major crisis. And this global challenge requires, for sure, a collective effort from international organizations, states, companies, civil society, in order to find and implement solutions. And this is the reason why I think your decision to choose such a topic for this year, and the reason why I came here today, is to make a call for action, and a call to all and every one of us. France has been very much affected by a lot of structural change and this relationship with globalization and what is at stake. And to be fair, I'm here in front of you today, but a few months ago I was not totally sure about that. And I had to fight with an actual, nationalist party. Why? Because you had a lot of fears, a lot of lack of understanding about this current globalization in my own country. First, because we didn't deliver properly, and the results were pretty poor. When you look at, unemployment, public deficit, growth deficit, and so on, and it's not yet totally fixed. And because some people proposed to French people just to get out from globalization as a very first solution of these issues. But this alternative does exist in all the different countries. And that gives me a special responsibility. The responsibility of building a France that is prosperous and open to the world, but also a France that is capable of recognizing and standing alongside those who have been forgotten and left behind by globalization. And it's not just to deliver and succeed, but in the same time is to show that it's more fair for middle classes and working classes. That's our challenge. That's the famous en même temps I tried to theorize in France, but which makes us, very much responsible of such a situation. The objective is very simple and straightforward. Make France more competitive, more innovative in order to finance precisely a fair system, and make it more competitive in an actual European power, which is the unique way to succeed for France. And I just wanted to wrap up the key pillars of such a strategy. First of all, for me, it's about human capital. Our world has changed, and today we need definitely less arms and more brains, talents, educated people. France has all the required talents in the country, but women and men have to adapt to changes and be trained in an efficient way. So we started to reform in depth, today again, our education system in order to better educate and train our people. Because when you look at the ranking, to be fair, Angel Gurria is with us. I'm sorry about the past years, but we decreased in this ranking, so we have to reform in depth this education system. We are reforming as well the rules in order to access to our universities, to precisely have a better access to universities. But more generally is how to invest more and to reform in depth this education and training system. We invest 5% of our GDP in education, and on top of this in-depth reform, we will launch very important reform of apprenticeship and vocational training, because it's absolutely core to deliver on this strategy and to train or retrain people in this current environment. Why? Because if you want to accompany people in this global change, you have to empower them. During years and years, the best answer, and it was both from left and right in France, was just to protect people by explaining, I will protect you from any change. We have sometimes to accelerate some change providing the real and the actual protection, which is to educate or retrain in order to find a new job. That's why we will invest during these 5 years 15 billion euro in education and retraining, and we will reform in order to simplify, streamline, and make much more efficient all the system. At the same time, we will make innovation the centerpiece of economy with a massive effort in terms of research and development. We will maintain and strengthen our different tax credit and fiscal incentive mechanisms. And on top of it, we will create a new 10 billion fund to finance development and innovation programs, and especially disruptive innovations. And we will dedicate 13 additional billions to fund precisely this development and innovation programs. It's once again on research and this human capital. The second key pillar of this reform agenda is precisely investment and capital. I mean, in such an economy that you perfectly know, which is an economy of innovation and competences, I mean, it's good to have a very competitive financing system. We have it in France, but it's much more oriented toward loans and lending issue than on equity issues. We need more equity in this current environment to finance risks and big innovations, and in order to finance our champions. So we passed a series of reforms in order to reallocate precisely our savings into that direction. We will pass new reforms. Part of these reforms are at the global, European and global scale to be negotiated. And I think we can de-risk our global system by facilitating this orientation towards more equity financing, especially on good and sustainable projects, and I will revert on it. But we passed a series of very concrete measures in order to facilitate such a move. By decreasing our corporate taxes, and we passed the law in order to decrease till 25% corporate tax. We were at 33, to be fair, during this mandate, in order to have a big reform on capital gain. And we will have a unique tax, 30% only, all in all, which will make us very competitive, and by lifting taxes on wages and on capital in order to accelerate this recovery in terms of competitiveness. And by reducing the cost of workforce and capital, we've reinforced France's attractiveness. And this is, for me, one of the key ambitions we should have in order, first of all, to facilitate the allocation of our savings and our capital in equity financing, in disruption and innovation, and to attract foreign capital in such a model. The third pillar is about acceleration and flexibility. In such a world, education and new safety nets is absolutely key to protect people. But you need more flexible structures and rules in order to facilitate this change, in order basically to help the different companies, startups or large caps to sometimes change their business model and readapt to this global environment. That's why we passed, summertime last year, a very important reform of our labor market. With the main philosophy, in a nutshell, is to realign France on Germany and Northern Europe, i.e., to have less rules defined by law and much more rules defined by consensus at the corporate or the branch level, i.e., much more adapted to your environment, your business environment, and facilitating the readaptation. That's a big change, and I think it makes it much more competitive and much more productive at home. And I think it was very much waited for decades sometimes by a lot of people. Acceleration and flexibility is also a series of microeconomic reforms, and that's what we are passing on energy, housing, transportation, in order to reduce the total costs for people, in order to improve competitiveness, and in order to make our economy much more rapid and efficient in this current environment in these critical sectors. And I think it's absolutely critical. The fourth pillar of this strategy is that we've also decided to make France a model in the fight against climate change. And that's, for me, a huge advantage in terms of attractiveness and competitiveness. We should stop opposing, on one side, productivity, on the other side, climate change issues. Why? Because a lot of people, talents will come where it's good to live, where, in pleasant place. Because you can create a lot of jobs, and I see the attendance. I have not many people to be convinced. But we can create a lot of jobs in such a strategy. So we passed a series of reforms as well in order to accelerate this green strategy, especially in CO2 emissions and reducing the CO2 emissions. That means we will close all our coal-fired power stations by 2021 during this mandate. It means we will launch additional research and development programs to step up the fight. And we've already attracted a lot of startups, projects, and research projects thanks to the Make Our Planet Great Again program with, hundreds of projects now arriving in France. The fifth pillar of this domestic strategy, and that's the last one, I can reassure you, I would say is about cultural change. And for me, it's probably as important as concrete reforms and laws and decrees and so on. And this cultural change is, first of all, now a preference for red tape cuts and simplification. France had a strong preference for regulation, laws, and taxes. Why? Because we love politics. And I think if we are fair during the past decades, we managed to better monitor than some other economies inequalities and these kind of issues. But we corrected these inequalities by taxes and regulations. We didn't prevent these inequalities. We corrected them by a lot of complexity. And these corrections basically definitely weakened our competitiveness and our growth. The big change is that we will have a strategy to prevent, and I will revert on it, these inequalities. But in the same time, we simplify, we streamline processes, and we definitely simplify bureaucracy. We took a series of very concrete measures in order to fuel this change of mindset. And the effect is that during the last 6 months, we reduced like crazy the number of new regulations, and we reduce the number of bureaucratic approach, and we are passing a law to totally change the relationship between administration and entrepreneurs and people. The second cultural change is about visibility. We have to guarantee stability for people, entrepreneurs, citizens, investors. All the reforms I mentioned about taxes and simplification, we passed them. And we voted a 5-year strategy in terms of taxes. That's brand new. Because, it's too easy to come and to say to you, I've changed this year my taxes, and the year after to totally change the rules, because unpredictability is absolutely counterproductive. So visibility is part of this cultural change. That's for the 5 years to come. That's a strategy, and it will not change. That's my personal commitment and the commitment of the whole government. And the third very important point in terms of cultural change is about risk. I often say in France it was forbidden to fail and forbidden to succeed. As you can see, it reduces basically your way to maneuver. Now, it should be more easy to fail, to take risk. So to reduce the cost of failure, to allow people when they fail to come back and to try something else, and to facilitate successes, and, to be granted for these successes. And for me, it's all about the relationship about risk. When you take risk, you need reward. And basically, you have to reduce this cost of failure. That's a big change if you want to succeed in the current environment. And that's the change we are making in France. And because France is a nation of entrepreneurs, is a nation of people loving this kind of risks. And I think it was a big mistake, and a big mistake when you look at our history regarding that. So, ladies and gentlemen, my first message is that France is back. France is back at the core of Europe. Because we will never have any French success without a European success. And for me, all these initiatives and this reform have an actual counterpart which is a European strategy. And I see a lot of European leaders and my very good friends, and all together we work very hard to have this common strategy. I will not revert on it, and I know that Angela Merkel expressed a few hours ago her vision, and we work very closely in that direction. But in a nutshell, I just want you to believe that the core strategy for me, for the coming years, and especially for this year, is to manage to deliver an actual refoundation of our Europe. We have to fix some short-term issues on energy, digital, migrations, and investment. This is a 2018 program. But this year will be the year where we have to redesign a 10-year strategy for Europe. It's sure. Because in this current environment, Europe has a responsibility and a role to play vis-à-vis China and the US. Because our vision, our DNA, in terms of relationship between freedom, justice, fairness, individual rights, is unique. You just have this kind of balance between these different values in Europe. You have a strong preference for freedom in the US. The approach of fairness is very different. You don't have the same approach of freedom in China. It's not a big discovery. So this synthesis, which is the core of our globalization and our multilateral approach, was made in Europe. And if we want to avoid this fragmentation of Europe, we need, of the world, we need a stronger Europe. It's absolutely key. And my view is that we have to redesign a 10-year strategy, because that's not an overnight strategy, a 10-year strategy to make Europe an actual economic, social, green, scientific, and political power. It's sure. That's what we have to build, which means we need more ambition in order to have a more sovereign, united, and democratic Europe. Which means on migration, digital, energy, defense, development, finance, investment, the core of what makes you sovereign in this current environment, we have to build our common policies. I'm not naive. We will never build something sufficiently ambitious at 27. And honestly, it's not. I don't want to say it's impossible to build it at 27. It's just that we have first to finalize the work we have at 27. But you need more ambition for, in a certain way, an open avant-garde of Europe to deliver on these critical issues. And we have to change our methodology, which is not to wait for all the people around the table before moving forward. But it's just to say, if some people are ready to be more ambitious, to go further in terms of integration and ambition of what makes you sovereign as a power in this global environment, to defend your values and your interests, let's move. And we open, the window on the door is open all the time. But those which don't want to move forward should not block the most ambitious people in the room. Because I think that such an ambition is the one we will make our Eurozone much stronger, much fairer, much ambitious in terms of investment, fairness, and much able to deliver a consistent message, what we want precisely to do in this current environment. I delivered a very long speech in September last year, and we worked very hard, but I do hope with my friends here present in this room, we will work together to have, at the end of this year, this common strategy for 10 years in order to provide visibility to our people and to the rest of the world about the fact that Europe is able to be this new power and basically to deal with some of those. Parce que, mes amis, je veux...
My friends, I must make a confession. I'd like France to find its place in world competition. And I think that the condition for that is that Europe should be stronger and should succeed in finding a new ambition. But that is not an end in itself. Economic growth is not an end in itself. And I often think that we've made mistakes. In our speeches, we said, well, things are going to get better because we're going to have growth. I think that there are a lot of countries where it can have 1 or 2 points more growth, but it doesn't resolve all the issues. And economic growth is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. I would go further. This search for economic growth has sometimes led us to forget what people are prepared to accept in order to achieve it. The globalization crisis we're going through today is linked precisely to that. The world is fragmented by a series of economic, geopolitical phenomena, some of which could have been anticipated and which are associated with that fracture. Now, we thought, or some people thought, that everybody was going to be affected. We're going to have growth, all the problems will be resolved in emerging countries or the newly emerging countries. That is not the case. Why? Because that growth is structurally less equitable. I think that all the experts show this, whether it is the international institutions or the ONGs. I think, NGOs, there is really only 1% that get richer. I think that you've got the financialization of globalization, which has led to concentration, and new technologies. I think we were talking precisely about this. The economy really gives encouragement to the people with the most talent. So you cannot find a one-stop solution unless we coordinate our tax issues, because otherwise talent will disappear. We've tried out that method. It doesn't work, and it's not going to work if you don't coordinate your positions. However, not to have a response isn't a good idea either. Then we are living in a wonderful world. Distances are shorter and shorter, but in our societies, everything is being refragmented. We have societies made of nomads which take advantage of globalization and whose lives are much closer to those in Bombay and in San Francisco, to the people who live just across the hall. And I think that you've got interests are then brought apart instead of being brought together. A few kilometers from here, there are people who think that solution is to get out of globalization, and there are more and more people who are convinced that that is the right option. Now, having said that, it means that we have a major challenge to meet. It's not just a challenge for governments, First of all, because governments, states, for many years now, are probably going in the wrong direction to meet those challenges. There is a political challenge, and a lot of governments think that you need to be more nationalist. Okay, we're not doing very well, we'll close our borders. And then there are challenges which people are frightened about: migratory flows, terrorism, technological change. Those are changes impose international coordination. I said that that was true for Europe, but it's not only Europe. Unless we are able to cooperate, we're not going to be able to take advantage of our comparative advantages. And comparative advantage means that you're actually dragged downwards. In fact, it is a question of being dragged downwards. And that is preventing us from meeting the fears and concerns. And I think that states have often gone in the wrong direction because we are actually fragilized, we undermined multilateralism. Whether it is the United Nations, the IMF, or other institutions, a lot of people have attacked those institutions, saying, well, we're going to take back our rights, we've got our own approach, we've got alternative solutions. But all those structures grew out of a period of history, as Professor Schwab reminded us. We saw what happened when you adopt a non-cooperation approach between governments when there were a lot of real fears. And for many years now, we have been going in the wrong direction. If you look at social law, tax law, all those subjects which are the basis of the state, we have really seen a weakening of positions. Now, I have told you what France is doing. In France, was really lagging behind the rest of Europe. But when I look at dynamism in the world today, we have a form of dynamism which in tax and social issues are continuing to show friends, well, to do less. That's what we should be doing. In fact, we should be reducing our tax. There is no limit. A race to the bottom, people are saying. The same thing for social benefits. If we don't establish a standard for international cooperation, we will never be able to convince the middle classes and the working classes that globalization is good for them. It's not true. It's just not true. In terms of trade, we are moving back again towards strategies which are based on non-cooperation, greater protectionism, fragmentation of what WTO has done in the past. And we are undoing what globalization has been able to achieve. And in terms of climate change, well, I think that many people were in Paris on 12th of December. We haven't been able to live up to our commitments. We are losing the battle. 2020 is not a meeting for a new conference. If we are not able to deliver concrete reactions, concrete results, how are we going to explain to people that they're going to be more vulnerable? And we have to show we've done everything possible to achieve what we set out to achieve. So on all these issues, which are issues which we're familiar with, we have really taken apart the international organization, we have weakened it, to which is added a number of subjects which we hadn't even seen. Accelerated urbanization, migratory flows, and technological change, which you explained, Professor Schwab. And each one of those leads to new forms of inequality, which, of course, worries people. I think that, once again, we feel that we're not really cooperating as we should be. We haven't established an organization at the world level which looks at all the changes that will be ushered in by artificial intelligence and big data. We have no common strategy here. In Europe, we don't even have a strategy either. In the United States, there is a strategy which is to allow the private sector to do whatever it wants. Now, of course, we use those tools on our devices, on our internet platforms, but they have privatized everything with all the consequences in terms of perhaps undermining the right to confidentiality. And in China, everything is being done public with the control of data, which is done on the basis of standards which are not the standards we want. But we've never had a multilateral approach on something which could lead to a destruction of millions of jobs and which could change the way we live our lives. And also the relations between citizens. It could change medicine or the knowledge I may have about you in terms of your capacity to be cured, as well as national identity. Now, I don't want to paint too bleak a picture, but I think that we're encouraging technological change. But unless we're very careful and unless we put a framework here, Schumpeter will really going to start looking like Darwin. And to live in a totally Darwinian world, I don't know if it's very good. Certainly it's not good for our populations. And it's not good for people who want to live in a democracy. So in view of all those realities and changes, and I'll finish up on this, what are the challenges we face and how do we come up with a response? And apart from what we're doing in our own countries and what needs to be done in Europe, I think that we've got to reconnect with a framework which provides for the common good. And the common good is also something which exists, such as sustainable development, health, education, security, social cohesion, human rights, and those common goods can never really be renounced. In our strategies, in our approaches, we've got to actually spell them out. We've got to create the right fora to be able to regulate those common goods in a cooperative manner. And I say that for governments, but also for the private sector. Nobody will be able to suspect me to be just business friendly. Nobody will be able to reproach the fact that we have an approach to the opening of economic development. But quite honestly, I say to you frankly today, if that approach doesn't produce results, it won't achieve. Now, my job as the head of a government will be to achieve that. And I hope that people in the private sector will come to France and will help to create jobs. But even in my country, unless I give a meaning to globalization, if I cannot explain to people that it's good for them, and that it will help them to develop their own lives in 5, 10 years, 15 years' time, they will be the nationalists, the extremists who want to get out of the system, and they will win, and it will happen in every country. So you cannot just say, well, what are we going to do? It's terrible when you've got nationalists and extremists or people have terrorist messages when they win. No, the challenge is now. It's in our countries. So the question is, do we know how to establish a new global contract? A compact which is not a compact between governments. And I say this quite frankly, if the part of that contract is not included in investment models, in the model of banks or enterprises and entrepreneurs, if each one of these people understands that they have a part to play in this global compact, it won't work. Because there will always be somebody who is going to be tempted not to cooperate, because there will be a real premium for free riding. I think that today we are in a situation where in our globalized world, a majority of powers are becoming free riders of our global system. That is the system we have today. And this new global compact has to be founded around three important commitments: the right to invest, share and protect. It's not exhaustive, of course, and I cannot be complete. I'm overlooking a number of subjects because I don't want to go on for too long. But let me just say a few things about each of these duties. The right or the duty to invest for states, but private sector in the common goods I mentioned, health in particular. But there is probably one area where we are not doing enough, and that is education. I was talking about the strategy we're developing in France. We have to do the same thing at the European level. But I think that throughout the world, and particularly in those areas which are in the greatest difficulty, in the world today we've got 750 million adults, 2/3 of whom are women, who don't have basic literary skills. So if there is one priority for our investments, is to invest in education, and the education of girls in particular. 1 million de femmes, 1 million d'hommes, 1 million de femmes, 1 million d'hommes. 1 million de femmes, 1 million d'hommes, 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 1 million Because if you don't invest in education, there will be no growth in the country. That means we're going to continue to have a predator-type strategy in the country which we operate as foreign investor. And if there is no investment in the education of young girls, there will be no equality between the sexes. There will be no place for women. And in societies where there are the greatest difficulties, sometimes for cultural and religious reasons, the solution is to be found amongst women. They will be the ones to construct the future, and the choice of certain countries to regress in terms of education, this is something we cannot keep quiet about. So in view of that, we need to invest massively in education. In Africa, in 2015, there were more than 101 million children who were not going to school, 53 million girls. Next week, I will be with President Macky Sall, and we're going to try and develop a partnership for education. And it's important that all the countries represented here commit to that. And I think that it's important that entrepreneurs and companies must commit. When you invest €1 in Africa, invest €1 in the education of girls. Otherwise, you're investing for the short term. If you're going to open a mine or some transport infrastructure, fantastic, and sometimes you'll get state aid, etc. And there is a lot of financing which will help you to achieve what you want. But also do something which will stabilize the country now. And so I think that there must be investment in education. There has to be a public-private partnership here. I think that this is absolutely fundamental. And I think you will have understood this. Investment in development, having a more ambitious development strategy than we have today, is indispensable if we want to avoid this fragmentation in the world. The second duty is the duty to share. Share of values is older than us, and has always been something that has irrigated capitalism. But there is a crisis of contemporary capitalism. In the globalization process, capitalism has become a capitalism of superstars, and the spreading of value added is no longer equitable. A lot of people don't look at how work is remunerated. So I think that we have to establish mechanisms to share value added more fairly. I think that we need to have a way of creating better incentives, not only financial incentives as well as environmental incentives. And I'm not just speaking about tax. If there is a greater social and environmental responsibility for companies, and talk about the right share of the fruit of growth and success when it is attained, in the criteria for investment, there will be a surveillance of how investments are made. And that will ensure sustainability. And if we're able to achieve that, we will be able to have a sustainable sharing capitalism. And we cannot afford to make mistakes. I think that there are companies that have been around for a long time, are the ones that have a strategy to share value added, where there are incentives for employees. Some with better incentive plans than others. So I think a situation has to be found, or the solution has to be found amongst investors, and I think that there has to be greater equality. When I talk about sharing value added in the companies, we also need to speak about gender equality. In France, we have a strategy in order to try and overcome salary gaps between men and women in the 5-year period. With the World Economic Forum, we are launching initiatives to develop indicators. And I think that it's important to have greater visibility in the private sector. And I want to welcome your commitment in this area. But I think that at the same time, collectively, we need to go further. And I would like to welcome the commitments undertaken by Justin Trudeau for the G7, and who said that he would put this at the heart of the Canadian presidency of the G7, and I would like to express my support to him. Now, if we want to share value added, I think that there is another important subject, which I sketched over when I was talking about the challenges of the contemporary world. It is the problem of tax. if we want to share values better, and I think it is better to finance and share the financing of common goods, we need to have a more coordinated tax approach at the global level. A race to the bottom will lead
Le moindre partage.
reduction in the financing of what we call the common good. So I think that there is a collective impetus to be provided. The OECD has done a lot of good work in this area, and thanks to that, we have prevented or tried to prevent the erosion of a tax base. We have signed a multilateral treaty. France is in the process of establishing a ratification process. Now, I would invite the United States and China to enter into the treaty. If the two countries won't join, we won't be able to achieve very much. So I'd like to say that this is the real partnership to avoid tax erosion. We need to have a peaceful basis for tax cooperation which avoids the optimization strategies of certain companies. And I think that there is a moral element here, a moral way of making profits. And I'll say this quite honestly. If you really believe that all the things that you've heard and the things that you think are pertinent and all the things that you have said during this meeting in Davos, then you cannot do tax optimization as it's being done today. And you've got to participate in this struggle, because otherwise it would mean that you're going to say that my business is going to have to finance common goods. So on that subject, I think we need to renounce tax optimization or unbridled tax optimization, and I think that we can go further here. There is another important aspect, talking about tax, how you can have a tax on digital activities. The major digital players are major players for innovation in our societies, and I think that we all want to have them in our country, want to develop them, so we can't be hypocritical about that. But at the same time, there is a twofold justice. How can I say to a start of my country, you're going to become a champion, when the big international champions don't pay any tax in my country, and the startup does? And how can I say that technological change is fantastic when those digital champions create the changes which I welcome, but where they don't pay taxes, and the one that distribute them in their business plans pay VAT, corporate tax, etc. It is an unfair model. And that is obvious. So we've got to put an end to an unjust system, and we've got to do this together, because otherwise people will worry that we will lose a competitive edge. As we haven't been able to organize ourselves, there have been tax hubs that have been created. It is something that is in the common good of the world. The major digital players provoke disruptions. Those disruptions are going to destroy millions of jobs throughout the world. We are going to have to retrain these millions of people who are going to lose their jobs. So education is a common good and has to be financed. If those who destroy the jobs don't help us to finance the training or retraining of people, how am I going to explain this to the working and middle classes? You won't either. So we've got to find a good framework for tax cooperation. I hope we will find that in Europe this year. I hope that we will achieve the same thing this year with OECD, and I hope that this will also be done at the international level too. Sharing also means refinding the vitality of cooperation in terms of finance and trade, as we had after the crisis in 2008-2010. And I'd just like to share a few proposals with you on this. I am in favor for the IMF be given a mandate to survey the whole financial system, particularly those areas which escape regulation. We have created the IMF. It has its legitimacy. It looks at what governments are doing, a part of the system in the financial sector, but it doesn't look at the least deregulated parts of the sector. Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, shadow banking, the most aggressive operators on the financial markets, the ones that can deregulate the whole system. They're not being looked at by the IMF. So we've got to have a discussion, and I hope that we will be able to do this within the framework of the G20. And Mr. Macri is going to be in Paris. I know that he wants to really put Argentina in the forefront of this leadership role. And I think that there will be a very important role to be played by G20. That will give us the possibility to give more space to regulation. We also need to think about how we're going to regulate the major players. The companies that are the major players. I've mentioned them, but there is also a lot of destabilization in our country because of technological change. We don't have a framework to regulate at the moment. When are we going to stop innovation? We're going to have to do this at some point. At what point are we going to say, artificial intelligence, this is a red line because it is disrupting not only old productive systems, but our relations with, or our attitudes towards private or privacy. It also calls into question of a number of philosophical principles. I think we need to have a framework of international cooperation in order to promote technology and so that we can promote our startups. But we've also got to establish principles which cannot be decided by economic players, but rather by governments. I think that there too we should have a discussion within the context of the G20. That is fundamental. The final challenge, it is to protect people. Protecting in terms of fight against terrorism, providing people with social protection. That is very important if we want to promote globalization. I think that it shows the important role that can be played by governments and states. For decades, people have said it's the end of government, the private sector will take over. But I think to be able to meet all these challenges, you need to have governments, you need to have international cooperation. On the societal aspect, we have to stop this question of really rolling back all our social benefits. And we need to have a discussion in the G20 to ensure that in monitoring being done by the IMF and other major bodies, there must be a monitoring of all those bodies that can promote social cohesion. I think that in Europe, when we provide help, particularly in the cohesion plans, we look at factors such as social convergence. We need to have certain criteria which allow us to measure social convergence. And we shouldn't be paradoxical by saying that this is what we're trying to do at international meetings, but asking the countries to roll back their social systems in order to take things down to the lowest level possible, and which doesn't provide the minimum protection that societies require. So I think that that is an area where I hope we will be able to create a dialogue between the IMF, the ILO, and that we'll be able to establish a list of criteria. In terms of climate protection, a lot has been said. I think that we've committed to many things, but we're still not up to the commitments. I think that China has really done an enormous amount of work here. It has maintained its efforts, and it has maintained its position in the Agreement of Paris, and it also participates in the carbon trading system, which is a very important element. I think that India is also very important. Prime Minister Modi opened the forum, and I think that that is very important as part of the transition, but we now need to follow through, and we need to respect the Paris Agreement. What does this mean? The European Union must go a little bit further and create a floor price for CO2. If we don't do that, we won't be credible. We have a CO2 market, and we've got to have a minimum price for CO2, and we've got to try and change the production model so that we're in line with our commitments. Secondly, I was in China a few weeks ago, and I was really impressed by the diplomatic initiative by President Xi, who mentioned this at Davos last year. I think that all the One Belt, One Road initiatives have to be in line with our climate goals. The new Silk Road has to be a green road. It cannot be a coal-based route. We need to have energy which allows us to reduce CO2 emissions, and we all need to cooperate in achieving that. Thirdly, we need to be able to continue going further, and I hope that by 2020 we will be able to have an environmental pact which will be legally binding and which will ensure justice for our citizens in terms of protecting the environment. And then the private sector must also live up to its commitments. Two big initiatives were taken in Paris at the One Summit meeting, and I hope that we'll be able to monitor progress regularly. And I hope also that all the investors, all the donors that have signed up will be able to regularly show that there is a real commitment by the private sector. And finally, it is the financial system which has to take or accompany this change with a promotion of green financing. I think that financing is very important. You cannot finance innovation or transformation without it. But we also need to finance a development model which is sustainable. And Europe has a fundamental role to play. In the European Union, in the Eurozone, we need to find a way of having a green financial center which accelerates these transition models. In terms of social protection, we need to provide protection to our societies and peoples. I think that that is an essential subject. Let me share a few of my convictions with you. The first thing is that we are committed in fighting against terrorism. Police are committed to fighting a lot of forces. Some of these terrorist forces were organized in different ways in the Sahel and other parts of Africa, but also in other parts of the world. I think that in our struggle against terrorism, we need to continue to work within our partners, both at the military and diplomatic level, but there are certain basic principles which must be respected, and that has to be done multilaterally. I don't think we can leave that multilateral framework and believe that the fight against terrorism is going to lead to greater fragmentation. We've got to fight against criminal organizations, but it shouldn't be a justification leading to a fragmentation of our responses. And acting in a multilateral way means that we put pressure on regional powers such as North Korea and Iran, but without really leading to the fracturing of certain regions. And this struggle has to be done within the framework of a political approach and a diplomatic approach. Unless we can find a political and diplomatic solution, terrorism will continue. Let us be honest, sometimes we have created solutions that have led to terrorism, believing that simply trying to get rid of a tyrant which we didn't like, that would solve all our problems. You cannot replace the sovereignty of peoples and their sufferings, and I think that only stable political solutions, sustainable solutions, will allow us to achieve a result and allow us to fight against terrorism, because it will prevent frustration being rekindled in these different countries. So we've got to not only win the war against terrorism, but we've got to create the conditions for durable peace in areas of the world which are engaged in this struggle. I'm thinking of the Middle East, of course, but I'm also thinking of Africa. I think our cooperation here is important. We've got to do peace building as well. I think everything is linked. We've got to give a meaning to globalization, which we're bringing to these parts of the world. And that's why development policy and our diplomatic activities is inseparable from our military policy. If you fight against terrorism in a country, but you have no development strategy, if you've got no education strategy for that country, now, you might one day win, but the next day the causes that led to terrorism will not have been eradicated. And I think that everything is interlinked. Terrorism has come back to the Sahel region. Why? Because we weren't able to provide a development policy, we weren't able to provide an education policy, and we haven't found an answer to climate change. And the destruction of Lake Chad has led to a real economic and moral crisis in the whole region. And that is why jihadists have been able to thrive. So fighting against terrorism is a military option, but it also requires a diplomatic solution. Now, I will finish up on this point. I think that the social contract has to involve all the stakeholders. We've got to fight against free riders and the strategy of free riding, which means we must also be consistent in our approaches. We should not have trade agreements with countries which don't respect health, social and other conditions. We should not have discussions on certain subjects with certain powers if they don't meet our criteria. And we ought to have a consistent agenda in terms of protecting what we call the public goods. We won't be able to do things from one day to the next. And I think that it would be much better that we come together and prevent the divergences increasing.
A new global and shared framework. And this framework should be based on cooperation and multilateralism, and absolutely not on a sort of new hegemony or fascination on new powers. It would be a huge mistake. Which means we have now a tremendous responsibility. Because this new framework, this new compact is the unique way to protect our interest on the long run, our common good, and our people. The answer is partly here, in this room. And in a certain way, our new frontier is not a geographical or a technological one, but it's much more our commitment. We are our own frontier, in our own conscience. If we commit ourselves to make our current globalization more fair, sustainable, in favor of middle classes, if we commit ourselves to enable our youth, if we commit ourselves to take into consideration long-term and complexity of our decisions and not just short-term returns, so we can converge and build a new globalization understandable and good for our people. Resuming this great idea of progress, we have the solution. We, as government, businesses, we just have a question. Do we decide to do it or no? And this is now. Thank you.